All right, continuing in our series of outstanding and remarkable doctors, we're now going to hear from Dr. Alan Goldhamer. Yeah, that's right. Dr. Goldhamer has been director of the True North Health Center for over 30 years. True North is a multidiscipline facility whose staff of 48 includes doctors of medicine, osteopathy, naturopathy, chiropractic, and psychology. Over 1,000 patients a year participate in their nutritional medicine program that utilizes a vegan, SOS-free, meaning salt, oil, sugar-free diet, and the use of medicinally supervised water-only fasting in the treatment of high blood pressure, diabetes, and numerous autoimmune disorders. Their internship and residency program trains 30 doctors per year, and they publish numerous papers of their methodology in the peer-reviewed medical literature. Dr. Goldhamer is also the author of the Health Promoting Cookbook and co-author of The Pleasure Trap. And Sabrina and I have both been up to True North, and we actually did 10-day water fasts on their medically supervised program, and I cannot recommend it enough. It's just an extraordinary place for a variety of reasons to go, and it's a real honor to present to you today Dr. Alan Goldhamer.
Good morning. This morning, I have a message to share with you. And this information may not be what you want to hear. But I assure you, it is information you need to know if your goal is to achieve and maintain optimum health. Today, right here, right now, we are witnessing an epidemic of obesity and the diseases associated with dietary excess. Conditions like coronary artery disease, in particular high blood pressure, diabetes, and a host of autoimmune disorders, things like rheumatoid arthritis and ankylosing spondylitis and lupus and colitis and asthma and eczema and psoriasis. If you're or somebody you know are given a diagnosis of one of these conditions, you're going to be told that the answer is pharmacologic. That is, you're going to be told to take drugs. How long is it that you'll need to take these drugs? For a day? A week? A month? Maybe a year? No. You're going to be told that you have to take the drugs forever, for the rest of your life. Now, how does your doctor know that you're going to need to take these expensive and dangerous medications forever? How do they know that? Because if you agree to take these drugs precisely as prescribed and do exactly what you're told, you will be given a guarantee. You'll be guaranteed to never get well. You'll be guaranteed to be sick forever. What a great business model. You get sick, you have to take drugs forever. No wonder the pharmaceutical industry is perhaps the most profitable industry the planet's ever seen. Fortunately, there is a better way, and it's an approach that we take at the True North Health Center. If we accept patients with one of these conditions, the first thing we often do is go through a period of medically supervised water-only fasting, bring the condition under control, eliminate the need for medications, and then follow that with a plant-based, SOS-free diet. And it works. You can learn to eliminate the causes of the problem, bring the condition under control, eliminate the need for medications, and we've proven it. In a study that we did with our colleague, Dr. Campbell from Cornell University, we took 174 consecutive patients with high blood pressure. And we put these patients through a period of fasting followed by a vegan SOS-free diet. And of the 174 patients were able to achieve pressures low enough to eliminate the need for medication. And of patients that had stage 3 hypertension, that is, their systolic blood pressure started at least at 180 milligrams percent, the average drop was over 60 points. Now understand the baseline pressures are taken on medication, the concluding measures are taken off medication, so it's 60 points plus whatever effect medications may have been having. That actually represents the largest effect size that's ever been published in treating high blood pressure in humans, doing essentially nothing. Water fasting followed by a plant-based, vegan, SOS-free diet. SOS, of course, is the international symbol of danger. It also stands for sugars, oils, and salts. But if you think that's impressive, I want to show you a picture. A little girl, her name is Kate. She's now 4 years old, and she just coincidentally happens to be my granddaughter. Now, Kate was born with over 250 million other babies on the planet 4 years ago. But in what may be the most bizarre statistical anomaly of all time, it turns out that my granddaughter Kate was the cutest one of all. Now, what are the odds of that? I don't know if you've noticed, but people are getting fatter. In 1986, shortly after I went into practice, there was no state in the United States that had over 14% of its population having achieved obesity. By 1990, obesity had become spreading throughout the United States. And by 1997, we needed a new color, because a few of these states here had managed to get over 20% of their population to become obese. By 1999, their neighboring states were joining them, and by 2001, we needed another new color. Here in the home of deep-fried ice cream, over 25% of the population had managed to achieve obesity. Now, obesity is at least 30 pounds overweight on a 5'4" person, a BMI greater than 30. 2002, 2003, 2004, 2005, another new color. 1 year later, 2010. Here comes 2011, 2012. Notice they're getting to be optimistic. They're anticipating a breakthrough where a state will achieve 35% obesity, but as of 2012, nobody had quite made it. It's not just in the United States. Obesity rates are rising throughout the world. They say there's differences between Europe and the United States. We're talking about the differences in diet, thank you. Percentage of overweight and obese adults with a BMI greater by region in the world, you'll notice that it's happening all throughout the world. In fact, today there's actually more people suffering as a consequence of obesity than deprivation. As an American, I'm proud to say, though, that when it comes to achieving obesity, there's nobody that beats America. We're number one. We're increasing our strategic fat reserves faster than anybody else, so I'm assuming that if spring comes late, we'll be in good shape. We are getting some competition, but you notice some of these countries down here in Asia only have about 3% obesity. It's like they're not even trying. We're not just getting fatter, we're also getting sicker. And the number of diseases associated with dietary excess, things like diabetes, are increasing dramatically, almost geometrically. It's affecting our adults, it's also affecting our children. As the obesity goes up and the diet that causes obesity goes up, the conditions associated with dietary excess go up proportionally. If you look back and you look at what used to kill people, say around 1900, before many of the miracles of modern medicine, you'll notice that infectious diseases killed over half of the people that died. Today, infectious diseases play a relatively small role in death. This is not due to the advent necessarily of antibiotics or drugs or miraculous treatments. This is mostly improvements in public hygiene, changes in the incidence of waterborne illnesses. And as we'll see later, that's had a profound effect. Today, of course, we have significant increased risk of dying from things like heart disease and cancer. So what actually does kill people and why today? You can see leading our list here is the use of tobacco. Tobacco is a fabulous tool for killing people prematurely, in part because it affects almost every organ system in the body. You know how if you're in a room and you look across the room and you see somebody, sometimes you can assume that there probably are or were a heavy smoker because they get that very attractive, premature, puckered look that comes from the wrinkling as a consequence of free radical exposure. Free radicals are reactive molecules that cause cross-linkaging of the collagen tissues. That's what caused the wrinkling and the premature aging look. And of course, it doesn't just affect the face. It doesn't just give you smoker's face. It also affects many of the tissues in the body, including the enamel lining of the blood vessels, which allow fatty plaques to form sores that'll break loose and cause strokes and heart attacks and other things later. So you can see that tobacco increases not just cardiovascular disease, but cancer and all kinds of other issues. Now they talk about developing safer cigarettes and these kinds of things. And one of the statistics I saw was that 80% of smokers will never get lung cancer. How dangerous can it be, right? It's because people die from heart disease before they live long enough to get the tumors to grow. So I guess if you really wanted a cancer-safe cigarette, all you'd need to do is make sure everybody died prematurely from heart disease, and then they could have a good marketing campaign. Elevated blood pressure is also our major cause of death and disability. And in fact, in the United States, if you don't have high blood pressure by the time you're 65, you're actually abnormal, because the majority of people will, in fact, develop hypertension. Alcohol. Alcohol also affects many organs of the body. And of course, if you listen to the media today, if you're not drinking now, you ought to start, right? According to them, alcohol is some type of health food. But nothing could be farther from the truth. Alcohol is really not your friend in any form and in any amount. And even moderate drinking is associated with increased risks of problems ranging from coronary artery disease to cancer. Elevated cholesterol, overweight, low fruit and vegetable intake, independent of weight issues, is an increased cause of death, as is physical inactivity, illicit drugs, and unsafe sex. You notice none of these conditions are conditions of deficiency. These are all conditions of excess. My colleague, Dr. McDougall, talks about these diseases associated with this as the diseases of kings, because it used to be these conditions, like coronary artery disease, were rare, but now they've become common, in part because of our changes in diet and lifestyle. So the question is, do adults live longer now than they did, say, in 1900, before the miracles of modern medicine? We know that life expectancy in 1900 was 47, and today it's 78. That's a 31-year increase in life expectancy. Yet, if we look at this data a little more critically, we notice that adults in 1900 that were 65 years old could expect to live 12 years. And an adult today can expect to live 19 years, so that's 7 years longer. And an adult 85 years old in 1900 could expect to live 4 years, today 6 years, which is 2 years older. So there's an interesting discrepancy here. We have a 31-year increase in life expectancy, but adults are only living 2 to 7 years longer. What explains that? What explains that difference is a reduction in infant mortality. It used to be almost 200 babies per 1,000 died in infancy and in childhood. But today, only about 7 per 1,000 die. So that means there's 193 more babies living to adulthood. And so for every child that lives to adulthood, it adds 70 plus years to the average. It pushes the curve to the right, and that's what life expectancy actually is, an average age of death of somebody born today. So it's not that everybody was dying in their 40s in 1900. What was happening was a significant percentage of people were not surviving infancy, in large part because of waterborne illnesses. So we've changed our numbers dramatically in terms of life expectancy, but adults are living a little longer today than they did in 1900. And if you expect the miracles of modern medicine to assure you a long and healthful life as an adult, you're going to be very disappointed. We've improved hygiene. We've improved water treatment, sanitation, and food sanitation. We've largely, at least in industrialized countries, eliminated starvation. And we have less deadly medical care in some ways today. If you think about the miracles of modern medicine, things like sulfa drugs, penicillin, they didn't actually come in until the 1940s. This dramatic reduction in infant mortality had happened long prior to that. This is a child. His name is also Colin. And Colin is my grandson. And he's now 9 years old. He was a little younger in this picture. But he is a constant reminder to me of how much life has changed. I had to explain to Colin the other day what it meant to send somebody a letter. I explained that, you take a piece of paper and you write down your message. And you get an envelope and you address the envelope and you put down the person's name and address and you put down a zip code. And then you buy a stamp and you affix that to the envelope and you give it to somebody who takes it to the post office and they put it in a sorting machine. And then they give it to somebody else who gives it to somebody else, and then a week later, hopefully, they deliver your message. And he said, "Oh, Grandpa, I know all about that. We studied it in school. They called it the Pony Express." He says, "Grandpa, that's just silly." He says, "You give it to me, I scan it and email it, and it's there in 45 nanoseconds. I said, "I'm really proud of you, Colin, that you know all about computers and scanning and email." And he says, "Why are you so impressed, Grandpa?" And I said, "Because when I was a little boy, we didn't have computers." And he said, "Oh, Grandpa, were you poor?" I said, we weren't poor. They hadn't invented them." He said, "Grandpa, when you were a little boy, had they invented electricity?" I told him my friend Thomas discovered it. He said, "Of course we had electricity." He said, "Well, if you had electricity, you really should have had computers." Human beings have changed over the millennium. If you talk to anthropologists, you see there was lots of things that were going on a long time ago. But around 100,000 years ago, humans, as we think of ourselves, appeared on the planet. There was a little crossover. There was some Neanderthal and other creatures. But essentially, we've been hanging around for about 100,000 years in this form. And one thing that has not changed significantly in the last 100,000 years is the human brain. The size of the human brain has remained relatively constant over the past 100,000 years. If we go back farther, we used to be smaller, we got bigger, brain was small, brain got bigger. For about the last 100,000 years, according to anthropologists, we have had relative stability. If we go back 100,000 years and look at the environment in which humans evolved, we find that it was not the same environment that we live in today. In fact, it was a very harsh existence. They say the vast majority of humans ever born on the planet never lived to reproduce. They didn't live long enough to reproduce, which means those people never passed on their genes or their DNA. The only ones that managed to pass on their DNA were the ones that survived, the ones that fulfilled the biological potential of life, that is, to get enough to eat, avoid being eaten long enough to reproduce. But we did obviously survive. There were times where it was pretty precarious. They say that 70,000 years ago, after a supervolcano in Indonesia erupted, the climatic changes that occurred were so severe that there were less than 10,000 humans thought to have survived on the planet. That's a level that would be associated with potential extinction. But we didn't completely bite the dust. Obviously, we're still here. And we did manage to survive because we had certain characteristics that favored our survival in the environment. One was that humans were clearly innovators. Our ancestors have used tools in a sophisticated way for at least 1 million years. We've used fire to process our foods, to provide heat, light, and protection for at least 500,000 years. Now that means that we've been cooking food for longer than we've been humans in this form. And perhaps the most powerful tool that the planet's ever seen showed up around 100,000 years ago. And that was a tool that allowed us to accumulate an information and pass it on in a geometric fashion, that being, of course, language. And the sophisticated use of language turned out to be a very powerful tool because it allowed us to take information that might have been accumulated over a lifetime of trial and error and pass it on in a few minutes by listening to people speak. But despite these tremendous innovations, the use of tools and fire and language, our population did not thrive. During all this time, from about 1 million years to 100,000 years ago, anthropologists tell us there's around 100,000 creatures on the planet, 50 to 100,000 creatures. So we survived, but it wasn't until humans made the connection between the seed and the plant that we really began to thrive. And so this advent of agriculture began to change everything around 10 or 12,000 years ago, relatively recently, biologically speaking. Because now humans were able to transform themselves from nomadic creatures that wandered around hunting and gathering and struggling to survive to being able to settle down in one place. And amongst other changes, it allowed for the diversification of labor. Not everybody had to be a subsistence farmer. It allowed us to take advantage of our innovative potentials. I got a chance to take this picture in Bhutan a few years ago. This is a country where I believe 93% of people are still subsistence farmers. You can see people hand harvesting rice. This is the Bhutanese red rice that many of us enjoy. And hand planting rice, very difficult work. So about 600 years ago, the next big human innovation came along, and that was the printing press, because now we were able to quantify the products of language and pass it on efficiently. But there was a problem. 600 years ago, just because somebody wrote something down didn't make it true any more than it does today. So we had a problem. We had all this language and all this talk, and we now had all this stuff written down, but we needed a way to tell the difference between what was real and what was not. The difference between fact and fantasy, a way to overcome human tendencies to make what are called errors of attribution, to misattribute cause and effect. And so we essentially invented a system, a mathematically based system, to help us do that. And that system is called science. And science, as we know it, has been around for about 400 years. Now, the scientific method is not perfect, doesn't answer every question, but it does a really good job of answering certain types of questions, and we've become quite dependent on science to help guide us forward. And it was about 200 years ago that the next big innovation came along, and that, of course, was the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution allowed us to change the face of the planet, and amongst other things, it also changed the nature of the food that we eat. Because although we used to raise food and eat food, we have gone now to processing food. And most of the calories that are consumed by most of the people in industrialized countries come through something that looks like this. This is a chart that shows population of humans on one axis against time in billions of years on the other. And you notice that all throughout our early evolution, where we have tools and fire and language, population remains relatively constant. By the time of agriculture, population begins to climb. By the time of Jesus Christ, you have 250 million humans on the planet. Today, 7 billion and counting. Now, if you applied this curve to an insect population, it's known as an infestation curve. Okay, this is you and your parents and your grandparents and your great-grandparents. And I want you to realize that if any one of these individuals had bit the dust and not lived to reproduce, you wouldn't be here. Back for 1,000 generations. If just one of your ancestors hadn't made it, you are the end result, the piece de resistance, the final product of a long chain of successful reproduction. And what's driven this largely is a large bulbous neuronal net located at the end of the spinal column in the human that we refer to as the brain. Our brains, remember, evolved in an environment of scarcity. So for the vast majority of the history, we lived in an environment of scarcity, where the biological imperative was get enough to eat, avoid being eaten, and live long enough to reproduce so you can pass on the DNA that drives all that. If you look at a representation here of a modern human brain, and you look at a human brain from 100,000 years ago, what do you notice? Well, they're exactly the same. Anthropologists tell us that there's been really no change in the size and presumably the function of the brain, at least in the last 100,000 years. Now that has some significant implications, because remember, 100,000 years ago, the world looked very different than it does today. Presumably, if you could take a child from today and transport it back 100,000 years, it would be raised by that family and they would not be able to discern the difference. Conversely, if you took a child from 100,000 years ago and could somehow magically transport it today, and you were to raise it, you would not be able to tell the difference. They would be just as annoying as children. They would develop just as many bad habits as teenagers. They would be essentially the same, because the brain that drives the body has not changed. But the brain was designed for this environment, not this environment. And the implications are profound. We've changed the environment, but we still have essentially the same brain. The way the brain directs the body is largely through chemical interactions. There's one particular chemical, this one, I'm sure you all recognize it, dopamine, which is C8H11NO2. And this chemical is particularly important because it's associated with an experience you know as pleasure. The more dopamine the brain squirts out, the better you like whatever it is. There are two behaviors that humans have to engage in order to live and reproduce. One of them is food, right? You got to eat. And the other one is sex. You have to have sex in order for the genes to be passed on and the cycle to begin again. Food and sex, food and sex, food and sex. Turns out food and sex are the only natural stimulants of dopamine production, unless you're a male human. Yeah, then it's sex and food. But whether it's food and sex or sex and food, these are the natural, normal stimulants of dopamine production. And you can imagine why. What if feeding behavior was not rewarded? Do you think people would remember to shop and climb to the tree and go through all those convolutions? Maybe not. And what if sex was not rewarded? You think people would do all that sweating and huffing and puffing if there wasn't some kind of positive feedback? I don't think so. So it made sense, and it's obviously worked, by rewarding behaviors that favor survival and reproduction in a natural setting. The brain has been able to direct the body to engage in behaviors that have resulted in our species, and by the way, all the other species we share the planet with, survival. This mechanism isn't just in humans. However, it turns out that humans, being the great innovators that we are, happened to discover that there were certain chemicals that artificially stimulated dopamine production in the brain, just like natural production from food and sex does. This is one of those chemicals, alcohol. People like alcohol because of the way that it makes them feel, because it artificially stimulates dopamine production in the brain. But there's a problem. When you artificially stimulate dopamine production, it can lead to physiological addiction. You can become literally addicted to the point where now you're not only drinking to feel good, you have to keep drinking to avoid feeling bad, which is a hallmark of addiction. And it turns out it's not just alcohol. Humans have spent inordinate amounts of effort finding each and every chemical that just so happens to stimulate that dopamine cascade in the brain. And there are other substances that act on these dopamine cascades as well. There's materials you can take, materials you can inject. There's stuff like this. You know what this is? No, it's not cheese. That's casomorphine. That's a whole different thing. This is cocaine. Yeah, cocaine turns out to be a fabulous artificial stimulant of dopamine in the brain. So much so that, for example, if you were to not that we would do this, but if somebody were to canalize the rats of a brain and give them access to cocaine when the little light went on, those rats will continue to press the little button until they're dead. They won't stop to have sex or eat or anything else. They'll just keep pushing that little light until they're dead. In fact, if you quantify what happens in the brains of people that smoke cocaine, you find out that if you compare how much dopamine is squirted out when you have an orgasm during sex versus smoking cocaine, there's 10 times more dopamine secreted having smoking cocaine than having an orgasm. I was speaking one time, different part of LA, and older woman, late 70s, early 80s, white hair, stood up and she said, "Excuse me, Dr. Goldhamer, where do you get cocaine?" That's not the point. What's this? Crystal meth, yeah. Oh yeah, somebody's born in the 60s. Yeah. LSD, PCP, ecstasy. Yeah. None of you know this. Marijuana. And of course, heroin, yeah. So we found all kinds of ways of artificially stimulating dopamine in the brain. And, you know, if this was the end of the story, we'd say, okay, drugs are bad, just say no, and that would be the end of it. It's not quite the end of the story, though, because it turns out there are certain chemicals that can be added to the feed supply that will result in very predictable behavior, because these chemicals artificially stimulate the dopamine in the brains of anyone that consumes them. For example, if we put these chemicals, say you take rats and you give them ad libitum chow, in other words, they can eat as much as they want, they'll get to a certain size. But if you put these chemicals in the rat chow, those rats will increase their weight 49% in just 60 days. Mice will get huge just by adding these particular chemicals into the chow. Now, if you do it to birds, the birds will get so fat they can't fly. So are the birds and the mice and the rats getting fat for psychological reasons or biological reasons? Are they getting fat because mommy bird didn't love them enough? And daddy bird loved them too much? Or is it biological reasons? Yeah, it's because you artificially stimulate the dopamine cascade in their brains from these chemicals. Now, it turns out humans, it works the same way. This was not the beginning of ergonomic design. When these stools were designed, people's posteriors were of somewhat different proportion. Today, our furniture is no longer fitting. It's affecting males, it's affecting females, and it's affecting our children. Childhood obesity is, by any definition, epidemic. And the long-term consequences of this are going to be quite devastating. You know, we can debate about one-pair, two-pair, six-pair systems. It's not going to matter how you chop it up. If we don't do something to stem the rising epidemic of chronic degenerative diseases, it will crush any system we try to put in its place. It's called the pleasure trap. And the fact is, food manufacturers fully understand this, and they literally have labs designed specifically to figure out which combination of chemicals to put into the food supply to make it more appealing, to make it taste better, because that's essentially what taste is how much dopamine secretion is stimulated by the foods that you're putting in your face. Pleasure trap also just coincidentally happens to be the title of our book, Mastering the Hidden Force That Undermines Health and Happiness, because it's our argument that the pleasure trap, this artificial stimulation of dopamine in the brain, is the reason people are overweight. It is the reason people are developing the diseases of dietary excess, the heart disease, the diabetes, the cancer of the breast, prostate, lung, and colon, the autoimmune diseases, that this is the force behind the fact. So what's an example of a chemical that food manufacturers knowingly put into our food despite the fact that we know this artificially stimulates dopamine production? What is C6H12O6? White crystalline material called sugar. This doesn't appear in concentrated form in nature. You have to manufacture this. And we do. We do to the point now where people in industrialized countries are consuming over 150 pounds a year per person of sugar and sweeteners. Now, I don't eat any, so somebody's eating my share too. And one particularly noxious form, high fructose corn syrup, which is processed in the liver much like alcohol and causes some of the same devastating effects, is heavily federally subsidized to make sure it's really, really cheap, so we ensure that the highly processed foods are also really cheap. We've increased the use of high fructose corn syrup over 1,000%. What's another chemical that we can put into our food? You all recognize that formula, right? Yeah. Oil. Oil doesn't appear in concentrated form in nature. We have to manufacture. You have to rip the cells apart and take the one highly concentrated component out. And we do some stuff with oil that's particularly obnoxious, like we'll heat it up to high temperature and then use it. We'll use things like starchy materials or whatever as a sponge to soak up the grease. Call them potato chips or French fries or what have you. See, I think we should stop kidding ourselves. Just find the deep fryer and stick your head in it and suck, because that's what you're doing when you're eating those foods. What's another chemical that's a precious commodity essential to human survival? In fact, this used to be so precious that it was used as a means of exchange or money. Absolutely, salt. Sodium chloride. Highly refined foods are what we call pleasure trap foods, or foods that contain added oil, salt, and sugar, SOS. Thus the term vegan SOS-free foods. These are the reason humans are getting supersized, because we're choosing to eat foods with these chemicals put into them. And they're so common, they're so ubiquitous that we think of them as normal substances, but they're not. Today, 93% of all the calories consumed by people living in industrialized countries either is animal foods, so meat, fish, fowl, eggs, or dairy products, or pleasure trap chemicals. Oil, salt, flour, sugar, dairy. Dairy gets to be on both lists. It's both an animal food with all the biological concentration problems and difficulties, plus it's a highly processed food, so it's like the perfect food if you're trying to get fat and sick. So the pleasure trap, the hidden force that undermines health and happiness, is any time you artificially stimulate dopamine production in the brain, results in potential vulnerability and difficulties. So the way that it works in humans is based on caloric density. So why would humans be designed as exquisitely sensitive energy detection devices? Why was it so important for our ancient ancestors to be able to tell the difference between calorically dense, valuable foods and less valuable, less calorically dense foods? Remember, they evolved in an environment of scarcity, so the brain was designed to make sure that you survived. If you could tell the difference between valuable concentrated foods and less valuable concentrated foods, that would have given you and your ancestors a selective advantage. So, for example, salad has 100 calories a pound. You need at least 2,000 calories to survive. So how many pounds of salad do you need to eat a day? About 20 pounds a day. Yeah. Can you eat 20 pounds of salad a day? If you start at 6 a.m. and you eat salad all day long till midnight, can you eat 20 pounds of salad? No. So you're not going to be able to survive very well on salad. Now, you can recognize that it's food, and if there's nothing else, you'll say, fine, I'll eat some salad. But your brain is not stupid, and it's not getting excited about it, because it recognizes there are some pretty serious limitations to this salad stuff. Fruit, for example, has 300 calories a pound, 3 times more than salad. What tastes better, fruit or salad? Now, why does fruit taste better to us than salad? There's sugar, which therefore stimulates more dopamine production in the brain. So more dopamine means it tastes better, which means it's more valuable, which means you're more reinforced. And, you know, you only need 7 pounds of fruit a day to survive. So, I mean, you know, it's still a full-time job, but at least it's theoretically possible that you could survive eating fruit. But if you're hungry, wouldn't you prefer to have a more concentrated source of calories, like potatoes, rice, and beans? Potatoes, rice, and beans have about 500 calories per pound, which means you'd only need about 4 pounds of these foods in order to survive. So if you have your choice and you're hungry, you're going to tend to go to the more calorically dense foods. Now, what if we invented a food? Of course, this doesn't exist in nature, but what if we invented a food that, say, had 1,200 calories a pound? Do you think that that would result in dopamine secretion in the brain and that you would like it and enjoy it? And if we introduced this food in the World's Fair in the 1800s, do you think people would line up and like it? And what if we called this food, I don't know, ice cream? Is ice cream a whole natural food? Have you ever fallen into an ice cream pond, you know, and had to eat your way out? No, of course, this is actually fairly tricky to make, and you have to go through a number of processes. And in fact, you're such a good energy detecting device that you can actually tell the difference between the Diet Delight stuff and super premium double chocolate chip, can't you? Even blindfolded, you can tell. They're trying to fool you. They can't. If you melt this stuff down and it becomes a syrupy liquid, it's often described as sickly sweet. It's so sweet that it makes you sick. Now, why does it make you sick when it's warm, but when it's cold, it tastes so good? What does it, suck the sugar out of the atmosphere or something when it melts? No. Of course, it has exactly the same amount of sugar. It's just that you're not designed to detect and differentiate foods that are artificially cold. There is no ice cream in a natural setting. And it turns out you don't detect sweet very well when something's very, very cold. And as a consequence, to make ice cream taste good, they have to supersaturate it with sugar. So when it's warm, it makes you sick. It makes you just as sick when it's cold, but you don't know it because you're bypassing your detection mechanism. What if we came up with an even more concentrated food than ice cream? Higher caloric density, more calories per unit than ice cream. Do you think people would like this? Would it result in a lot of dopamine stimulation? And what if do you think people might even call this the staff of life if we introduced it? Have you ever seen this stuff before? Crusty on the outside, hot, steamy on the inside. Yeah, 1,500 calories a pound, and that's before you turn it into a butter boat. Have you ever been in a restaurant and they put a basket of this stuff on the table? It's all hot and steamy. Your brain detects it. Oh, give it to me. And you open up that napkin and you have a piece or 2 or 3, don't you? And after a while, what do you notice about the basket of bread? It's empty. It's all gone. So what do? Yeah, you spread out that basket all naked there and push it towards the edge of the table. Napkin opened up, and you wait, and you wait. And of course, you're thinking, does this guy want a tip or not? Finally, the waiter comes by. He almost trips over the basket because you got it kind of sticking out there in the aisle there. And he notices that it's empty, and he says to you, "Oh, did you want some more bread?" Of course, first thing you have to do is pretend like you didn't know it was empty. And you look over there and say, "Oh, sure, why not?" And he brings you some more bread. Let me ask you, do you ever go into that same restaurant and say, "Excuse me, waiter, I'd like you to bring me 3 large baked potatoes because I want to eat those before I order my dinner"? Do you do that? Do you eat 3 large baked potatoes before you order your dinner? Why not? Yeah, because you'd be too full. Because it turns out that 3 large baked potatoes is about how much volume the human stomach can handle. It would completely mechanically fill the stomach up. There wouldn't be any room left. But that same 500 calories of bread only takes 1/3 of the stomach. Because bread is a highly processed, refined food product where you've taken a grain, ground it into a flour, baked at high temperature. And so there's plenty of room left for the greasy, slimy, dead, decaying flesh, highly processed food stuff that they want to sell you. So what do you think you're going to be getting fat on, the bread or the potatoes? Yeah, it's not the potatoes. Of course, sugar, pure sugar, has 1,800 calories a pound. Do you ever go into that same restaurant and sit down and just say, have 11 teaspoons of sugar? Get them packets out and start just kind of... Do you do that? Why not? It's free. They don't even have to charge you for it. It's so cheap. So you don't eat 11 teaspoons of sugar before you... No? You ever have one of these? You know what this is? Yeah. Used to put cocaine in there, but they found a better drug. It's called caffeine. 12-ounce Coke, 11 teaspoons. Now, you used to have 10 teaspoons, but they figured out how to make it better. I think they didn't put 11 in the old stuff because it would come out of solution. It would show up in the bottom of the bottle, and people would go, "Oh my gosh, they're putting sugar in this stuff." But with a little more phosphoric acid or something, they can get it a little bit more in there. Now, it used to be a 12-ounce Coke might have been a special treat for a kid, right? Not anymore. Now it's a 55-ounce big gulp with free refills. Yeah, and that's not really enough. You got the big gulp, the super gulp, the double gulp, the express gulp. I swear, pretty soon you're going to need to have a bucket. That's the way. And I think in the future, the leading cause of back injury is going to be going to one of these stores. And it's going to have to, yeah. 25% of the calories in teenagers, according to some studies, come from the sugar and soda pop alone. Just the soda pop, just the liquid calories. We don't know why our kids are getting fat and sick. It's a complete mystery. Oh, chocolate. What tastes better, salad or chocolate? You think that's like a cultural thing? Or if we took 1,000 people from 1,000 cultures, lined them up, blindfolded, a mouthful of chocolate, a mouthful of salad, what, you think they could tell the difference? 2,500 calories a pound. Yeah. Of course, I tell my patients, if they want to have chocolate, what they need to do is melt it down or rub it all over their belly and hips where it's going to end up, and then they can at least wash it off and not carry it around all week. Chocolate. I mean, just looking at it's making some of you salivate. You don't even have to taste it. There was a survey of women, not men, just women. And they asked these women, what would you rather do? Have mad, hot, passionate sex or eat chocolate? 2 most common comments, what kind of chocolate and how many pieces are we talking about? Potatoes taste good, but potato chips taste great. And when they say, bet you can't just eat one, do you think they're kidding? Potatoes have 500 calories a pound. Potato chips have 2,500 calories a pound. 5 times the caloric density, concomitantly increased dopamine production. Notice my subliminal teaching techniques. Caloric density of whole natural foods. Caloric density of pleasure trap foods, culminating, of course, with oil. 93% of calories, virtually all the food that's eaten now, as you would expect if you understand the pleasure trap, is either animal foods or highly processed food byproducts. Now, some of you are vegans, naturally optimists. You look at this chart and think, but wait a second. 7% is still fruits and vegetables. There's hope. Let's keep hope alive. And I don't mean to rain on your parade, but of that 7%, 1/3 of it's just one vegetable called potatoes, usually served as French fries or potato chips. Fruits and vegetables no longer make a statistically significant percentage of the diet of adults or children. They are now the decoration on the plate. It is the pleasure trap. And it's a huge problem. And it's a problem not just for people that eat conventionally, but it's also a problem for vegans and vegetarians, because many vegans, as you know, are driven primarily by moral, ethical, and spiritual reasons, the protection of animals, the planet, and all the other perfectly valid reasons for being vegan. But they're not necessarily driven by their own personal health, and so a consequence, they eat a lot of highly processed sugar, oil, and salt products, to the point where you're seeing much of the same difficulties, even in people that are vegans. Certainly in my practice, I see a lot of vegans that have serious health problems, not because they lack animal foods, but because they're eating highly processed food byproducts. We have a couple cookbooks. One is the Health Promoting Cookbook, and the other one is the Bravo Cookbook, made by our chef. And these are all vegan, SOS-free recipes, so for those of you that want that extreme health version, these are good resources. And, of course, our book, The Pleasure Trap. What I'd like to do, if there's time, is open up the floor to questions and try to answer anything that I can. Yes, sir?
Salt doesn't have calories. Why is it a problem?
That's a good point. Salt is not actually in the same class as oil and sugar. And salt is, in fact, an essential nutrient, without which you would die. It turns out, though, that all of the sodium that you need in your diet is found abundantly provided by a whole foods plant-based diet. So you get that gram or gram and a half of sodium that you need naturally from the foods. And because salt in a natural setting is such a rare and precious commodity, our bodies have been designed to hold on to that sodium very carefully. And as a consequence, when we start increasing our sodium concentration to 2, 3, 4, 5, or 10 times as much as we're designed to eat, we hold that sodium. Sodium itself becomes a toxic substance in the sense that, for example, if you take a tablespoon of salt, it's an emetic, it'll make you throw up. If you take a larger quantity, it can actually kill you. The sodium in a higher concentration causes the body to compensate. It holds fluid, which drives blood pressure up, causes swelling, edema. It acts as a powerful appetite stimulant. So, in other words, if you eat a certain amount of rice and you feel full, but if you salt it up, you may find yourself eating a significantly higher percentage of that same substance before you reach satiety. So it alters satiation mechanisms. So on a number of levels, sodium ends up acting in a very unhealthful way when it's used in concentration. Fortunately, if you just don't add salt to your food, you get all the sodium you need and avoid the problems with dietary excess. But it is slightly different than the dopamine cascade mechanisms that we describe with the pleasure trap. Yes?
I have a loved one that has Parkinson's disease in his late 50s, and I'm just wondering, as much as a healthy person, an active person that he is, I still see those cravings for, the processed sweets. And is there any suggestion that you would have for somebody like that, especially since he's trying to minimize the addition of any new medications or mixtures of medications because they kind of get diluted, I guess, over time and aren't as effective?
Well, actually, what happens in Parkinson's disease is this is a disease where there's postsynaptic neuron damage. And so the treatment is to provide L-DOPA to try to flood the brain with enough of the necessary chemicals so that the body can function. You have less tremor, better function. The problem is the medical management approach uses cardopa. And the reason, if you give L-DOPA straight, what happens is people get very severe nausea, and they can't take enough in order to be able to maintain control of the condition. So they use cardopa, which interferes with a pathway associated with the development of nausea. The problem is the way that it works is it binds up vitamin B6, and it creates a vitamin B6 deficiency over enough time. So years down the road, the B6 deficiency blocks the 200 chemical cascades that are associated with it. And you can't just give B6 because that doesn't work, and it would, even if it did work, you'd be back to having the nausea issue. So a lot of the problems that are associated with progression of Parkinson's are actually not. They're actually a consequence of the toxicity that comes from the drugs that are used to treat it. Now, fortunately, there's a better way, for example, that we utilize at the True North Health Center. There's a gentleman named Marty Hines, H-I-N-Z, who's pioneered, actually, the use of a nutritional medicine approach at managing Parkinson's. We still use L-DOPA, but use 5-HTP and other natural substances to counteract the effects of the nausea. And that eliminates the B6 deficiency, the poisoning from cardopa, and the outcomes are actually quite good. You can get good control of the Parkinsonian symptoms without the toxic effects from the pharmaceutical medications. Diet alone isn't enough to overcome this problem. It does require a nutritional medicine approach, but it's one that we have doctors at the center that have trained with Marty Hines and do a good job of implementing that protocol. And he has about, 200 articles published in the scientific literature you can find online that talks about this work. Understand, though, whether a person is seriously ill, as many of our patients are, or they're perfectly asymptomatic, it doesn't change the nature of the addiction. Essentially, most of us are addicts. We're addicted to the artificial stimulation of dopamine in our brains, whether it comes because we're drinking alcohol or caffeine or smoking cigarettes or using oils and sugar chemicals in our food. We are addicts, and we will fight vehemently to defend our addictions. If you go up to an alcoholic and say, you know how your life really sucks? It's because of the alcohol. Do they go, oh, it's the drinking? I had no idea. Oh, thank you. I won't drink anymore. Or do they tell you to mind your own business because they don't want to hear about it, right? Think about how we manage obesity in the United States. Do we tell alcoholics, for example, you drink too much, so you need to learn to drink moderately. Put your alcohol in a smaller cup, and then you won't be a drunk anymore. Drink your alcohol with a spoon, and split the spoon down between each drink, and then you won't over-drink anymore. Just drink beer and wine, and stop with the hard liquor, and then you won't be an alcoholic. Is that what we tell alcoholics, that they need to learn to drink moderately? Why don't we tell alcoholics to drink moderately? Because it doesn't work. That's the problem. It just doesn't work at all. What do we tell obese patients? Oh, you're fat because you eat too much. Eat less. Okay, put your food on a smaller plate. Chop it into little bits and then put your fork down between each bite. You won't be fat anymore. Does that work? No, it doesn't work at all. So why do we keep telling people that? We tell alcoholics what? Stop drinking. You got to come up with a strategy that each and every day gives you the ability to choose to not drink. What do we need to tell fat people if they want to lose weight and keep it off? Stop fooling your brain by eating the chemicals that are leading to your obesity. The oils, the sugars, the processed foods. It's not going to be easy for the alcoholic to quit drinking. It's not easy to lose weight. Now, does that mean nobody could ever have a drink because anybody that has a drink becomes a drunk? No, there are some people that can have a drink and they may not become an alcoholic. But if you're an alcoholic, that's not you. And there are people that can have that piece of chocolate or cocoa bud or cheese thing or whatever and not become fat. But if you're overweight, it's not you. If you could have stopped or controlled it, you would have stopped or controlled it. It's not like you didn't try. You can't. And so what you need to do is recognize that and stop fooling your brains. Adopt a plant-based whole foods diet. Fruits, vegetables, grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds. And stop with all the meat, fish, fat, eggs, dairy products, oil, salt, and sugar. If you do that, guess what happens? You lose your weight. Men lose an average of 3 pounds a week. Women lose an average of 2 pounds a week following this diet with moderate exercise. Do men lose 50% more weight because they're better, more disciplined? We have a stronger psychology. No, we have testosterone. Testosterone is a fat-burning hormone. If you inject women with testosterone, they lose their fat. Of course, then they get hairy and get cancer and die, so it's probably not a good management strategy. If you inject men with estrogen, guess what happens? They get fat. They get breasts and hips, and these are biological differences, not psychological differences. The fact is, women have to work harder in this and pretty much everything else. Get used to it. You know, that's the way that it is. I have to say, my father, who was married for 68 years, told me the secret to a successful marriage. And he was a math teacher. And he said, you just have to understand the math of marriage. He says, if you understand the math of marriage, you will be assured a long and successful marriage. And the math goes like this. Women are correct, on average, 90% of the time. And men are correct, not so much. So if the man understands the math, he will always agree with the woman. And a man that always agrees with his wife gets 90% correct, and 90% is an A. So you just learn the two magic words, yes, dear, and you'll be successful. And I just celebrated my 30th anniversary, and for anybody that knows me, you know that's a miracle. And she's agreed to renew my contract again. In fact, this year I'm going to ask for a 2-year extension. I think I've earned it.
Hi. I know you've explained this, and I sort of understand the calorie density. I eat that way, at least. Whatever. But what I don't quite understand is when we say that, for instance, oil is, 4,000 calories a pound? My first response is, well, I'm not going to be eating a pound of it. Why does that matter?
Right. So it's not a question of, the use of pounds or ounces or mouthfuls is just a means of comparison. Because oil has 40 times more density per any volume you want to say, it creates this huge problem. For example, if you have a pound of salad, but you put just a tablespoon of oil on the salad, there's more calories in that little bit of oil you drizzle on the salad than the entire salad. So it's important to think in terms of, for comparison purposes, we use density. Of course, you're not going to eat a pound of oil, but that small amount of oil you add in the diet has a disproportionate effect in terms of its ratio of calories to density. And it means essentially, how fat do you want to be? The fatter you want to be, the higher proportion of those processed foods you want to put in the diet. If you want to lose weight, you need to get rid of those things. If you're trying to gain weight, then we might increase caloric density in the diet by processing food more, doing, you know what I mean? So you modify the diet based on what your goal is. For most of us, we're trying to either lose or maintain weight, not gain a lot of fat. And as a consequence, we want to avoid these highly processed, highly concentrated chemicals that are added to food, like oil. You pick. I can't see.
Okay.
About life expectancy, I'm interested in the statistics you gave about our increased longevity in the United States in relationship to some countries that still don't have heart disease and cancer. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, there are no countries that don't have heart disease and cancer, and the ones that have reduced rates of heart disease and cancer are rapidly catching up as they adopt our food processing techniques. So you understand that these techniques work with all humans. If you increase caloric density, they get more dopamine production. So the form with which the highly processed foods are being introduced may change. But the more they like the food, the more they'll buy the food. And so as our techniques are being spread throughout the world, you're going to see that same wave of increase, and that is exactly what's happening. So as our approach to increasing caloric density is adopted and people eat less and less whole natural foods, they're going to get more and more of these diseases.
I have a friend who has ulcerative colitis, and his doctor told him that to prevent cancer in the future, he needed to take medication for the rest of his life to prevent. Is there anything else that might work?
Yeah, with ulcerative colitis, like all autoimmune diseases, understand autoimmune diseases, whether it's ulcerative colitis or rheumatoid arthritis, ankylosing spondylitis, or lupus, or any of these conditions, the problem that you're seeing, the symptoms that you're seeing, are a result of your immune system attacking your tissues. It's actually your immune cells that are attacking your tissues. So why in those genetically vulnerable people are the immune systems attacking their own cells. If it's the colon, we might call it Crohn's or colitis. If it's the skin, it might be vasculitis. You know, depending on the organ that's being attacked, depends on how we name the condition. But one of the things that these conditions often have in common is they're aggravated by a process called gut leakage, where materials leak through the intestinal membrane, stimulate the immune system, and in genetically vulnerable people, the immune system gets confused and begins to attack its own tissues. One of the best ways to cause gut leakage is through foods that are rich, say, for example, in free radicals. So smoking, cigarettes, drinking alcohol, eating highly concentrated, high-fat, high-temperature processed foods, oils, fried foods, etc. Over time, this inflammatory process becomes so bad you start to have symptoms. You might have 20 bloody bowel movements a day, or you might not be able to breathe with asthma. And so the medical treatment typically involves using medications that shut down the immune system. So things like steroids, cortisone, anti-cancer drugs, other materials. And at first it's like a dream, because the symptoms go down and people feel a bit better, and then of course it becomes a nightmare, because you need your immune system. And when you shut down the immune system to stop it from reacting to this dietary onslaught, you make yourself vulnerable long-term to all kinds of terrible problems. So the answer in treating autoimmune disease is, number one, get rid of the things that cause the inflammation. We do that at the True North Health Center by using medically supervised water-only fasting. And we'll fast patients, wean off their medications, put them through a period of fasting, until the inflammation goes down. And then we feed them a diet that doesn't promote inflammation, so a diet that's free of animal foods and highly processed chemicals. And the diligent application of this approach can work remarkably well at people bringing under condition. Oftentimes they'll be off all medication and better than they ever were on medications. And of course you avoid the long-term consequent effect of medications. Not everybody recovers to the degree immediately that you don't have to kind of deal with medical management, which is why we have physicians at the True North Health Center that aren't complete idiots. And they're able to help bridge that gap between nutritional medicine and conventional medicine and kind of help people navigate that slippery slope. So the point is, you have to have people that are willing to do dangerous and radical things, like eat good and exercise appropriately and get enough sleep and avoid excessive stresses so that the body can do what it does best, and that's heal itself. And these conditions, I particularly like working with people with autoimmune disease, because once you get them well, they can't cheat. What happens as soon as they try to eat greasy, slimy, dead, decaying flesh? They get pain, and pain is a hugely helpful motivating factor to change behavior. So I remember I had a woman with lupus, which is not the same, but a related autoimmune disease, and she came in and was a younger woman on prednisone, methotrexate, all kinds of drugs with her lupus, a lot of pain. We went through a period of fasting. She fasted, I think it was about 3 weeks. Her condition came under control. We got her on the diet. She goes home. She's doing fine for like 6 months at home. And then she calls back and she says, oh, I think I need to come back and do another fast. And I said, why? And she said, suddenly her pain all came back. I said, well, what did you eat? She goes, no, I'm on the program. I'm doing everything right. I said, what did you eat? She said, no, I'm doing everything right. I had salad and steamed vegetables and carrot soup for dinner last night. I said, who made the soup? And she said her friend did, but she knows she's a vegetarian. What did her friend put in the soup? Well, cream. Because vegetarian is no meat, right? And that one meal was enough to flare up her condition. Isn't that great? She can't cheat, even accidentally. See, to me, that makes a really good patient, you know? If they get agonizing pain when they make even the slightest variation, that's great.
I just wanted to ask a question about casomorphins. I've read about those recently. Yeah. Are you aware of any manufacturers that are deliberately adding those to their food? Well, and if not, it's an opportunity to get another really dark color on those maps, I think.
I think that Neil Bernard is the gentleman that talks a lot about casomorphins in dairy products, but I think those are currently naturally occurring, that it's produced, its design is to help bond the baby cow to the mommy cow and, you know, all that stuff. So I'm not aware yet that they've been adding casomorphines. As, for example, the cigarette smokers are spraying nicotine onto the tobacco, that kind of thing. But that's a really good idea, and I suggest that you contact the manufacturer of the dairy industry, because they probably would sponsor a study. They certainly won't sponsor our research.
You touched on caffeine. What effect does caffeine have on dopamine? And also, what natural sweeteners work that don't set off dopamine, like xylitol or stevia?
Right.
Or?
Well, first of all, answer your first question. Caffeine, of course, is a highly addictive nervous system drug. In fact, some of the most difficult withdrawals we have from patients is withdrawing them from caffeine because they're drinking coffee and eating chocolate. And I think it's particularly obnoxious that we give our children highly addictive nervous system drugs hidden in their little food and snacks and basically teach them to be little drug addicts from an early age. If you want to know what caffeine does, just stop using it suddenly and see how you feel and tell me that it's not a highly addictive drug. Of course it is by any definition. It has all kinds of problems ranging from disrupting digestive function to increasing endogenous production of cholesterol, et cetera. I mean, you can go look on the internet and you'll find page after page of problems that come from caffeine use. It is a stimulant, so people like that, but anytime you have stimulation, you know there's going to be some kind of compensatory depression that's going to follow. So, caffeine is a drug, one of the many drugs that we want to try to exclude from human intake if optimum health is what we're looking for. And what was the second? Well, all these attempts to try to, how can we make it sweet without getting fat or paying the price, turn out to fail miserably. If you look at the studies on the use of diet sodas and stuff, people, the more diet soda they drink, the fatter they get. And so the problem is when you start going in and try to manipulate this mechanism that's so well designed with all these artificial chemicals, all you end up with is a mess. And so without going into all the details on each of the different sweeteners, none of them are any good and all of them need to be excluded. And also you have to ask yourself, what am I eating that I need to sweeten? Usually some highly processed, refined grain product that would taste like crap as it is because you've taken all the goodness out of it. What's interesting is if you want good foods to taste good, you have to actually start with good foods, which is why food manufacturers don't want to do that. What do you expect them to use, like fresh, wholesome foods? No, they can take any heavily federally subsidized, highly processed grain, corn, wheat, soy. You put enough soy, sugar, oil, and salt on it, people will think that it's a good thing because it'll stimulate dopamine in the brain. You can ship the stuff around the country. You can let it sit on the shelf for weeks or months or longer. It's extremely efficient for them, just not so good for you.
Dr. Goldhamer, could you please expand on your juicing regimens, on why they change the taste buds so quickly and how it overcomes food addictions?
Our juicing?
Yeah, the juicing regimens that you do after water fasts.
Okay, well, it's not actually the juicing regimens that taste there's a process called neuroadaptation, taste neuroadaptation. If you're addicted to the artificial stimulation of oil, salt, and sugar, good foods don't taste good. Probably best demonstrated by giving you an example. We became at one point a fully covered benefit for one of the big labor unions in California, the International Union of Operating Engineers. And they sent, our program was covered, and so the very first gentleman that we saw from the union was a crusty crane operator. I'm telling you, his neck was a lot bigger than my thigh. Overweight, hypertensive, diabetic, lots of meds. Probably the last person you would expect to be going to an alternative health facility. And the thing is, his employer had not told him what the program consisted of. They just said, look, your blood pressure's too high, you can't drive the crane, we're afraid you're going to stroke out and kill somebody. Go to this program, get well, and then you can go back to work. And so he comes in, and he's like looking around saying, I don't know what I'm doing here. And I said, well, you're here because you're sick. He says, I'm not sick. I said, well, of course you are. You have high blood pressure and diabetes, and you're going to die. And he said, well, don't we all have to die sometime? I said, well, yeah, but you're on $800 a month worth of medications you may not need if we can get you healthy. Thought that would do it. And he said, what do I care? My union pays for the drugs. I'm thinking, this isn't my normal patient. So I'm thinking about his medical history, and I thought, I said, if we get you off all those drugs and get you healthy, there's a good chance we can do something about your little problem. He starts to sit up, and I'm thinking, uh-oh. And he says, why the hell didn't you just say so? So we're checking him in, and we're trying to feed him some food before we start this fasting process. And this is the kind of guy that would get a triple cheeseburger, lift up the bun, and take that little piece of lettuce off. And he's trying to eat some of the food we put in front of him, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, we must have missed the fact he's got a tumor in his esophagus, because he's like, clearly in pain. So I sit down next to him and I said, it looks like you're having a little problem with the food. And he said, what food? He said, this is disgusting. He said, if I have to eat tasteless swill like this the rest of my life, I'd rather just die. He says, why don't you go out to my pickup truck and get my shotgun? You can just shoot me in the head. So we check him in. He ends up fasting 26 days on water only. Normalized his pressure, got him off his meds. He lost a lot of weight. And now we're refeeding him after this fast. And we put the food out, and now he's actually eating the food. And so I sat down again next to him. I said, it looks like you're doing a little bit better with the food. And he says, yeah, your damn chef's finally getting the hang of it. It took me 20 minutes to convince him it was the same food he was trying to eat before. He said, oh no, that stuff you tried to make me eat when I came in was disgusting. He said, this stuff's not bad. That's where we got the theme of the True North Health Kitchen, where we make good food taste not bad. He went through taste neuroadaptation. If I had sent him home and said, well, just eat this diet and you'll get, the chance of, I couldn't have even gotten one meal of compliance. Post-fasting, now the food doesn't taste so bad, now we have a fighting chance. Interestingly enough, I saw him 6 months later, 60 pounds later, at a semi-annual where we were doing blood pressure screen. I said, so how you doing? He says, I'm doing just fine. Talk to people about something they care about.
We are going to have Dr. Goldhamer on the panel later this afternoon where we can continue with more questions. I want to thank Dr. Goldhamer very, very much for his presentation.
I just make one final comment. If for some reason you don't catch me today and you can't get your question answered, please feel free to call me at the True North Health Center or email me. If you go on our website at healthpromoting.com and complete the registration forms, which gets me your medical history, we'll give you a free phone consultation with me. You can call up, we can go through and see if there's anything we have to suggest that might make a difference for you. Thank you for your time.